I've been a bus driver for over 20 years, making the same route between Washington, D.C., and the Appalachian Mountains. Most days are ordinary, filled with the usual hustle and bustle. However, one night, about 5 or 6 years ago, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a typical night. My bus was fully packed, since it was the start of a long holiday weekend. We were set to leave from Union Station at 8:30 p.m., and were expected to reach the mountains early the next morning. We had made our usual stops, and everything was proceeding as planned until we hit a patch near the mountains. It was around midnight when we got a flat tire. There was a rest stop nearby, so I directed the passengers to take a break while we fixed the tire. A group of passengers, mostly older women, were singing hymns, creating a calming environment. But as the repair dragged on, I decided to take a quick smoke break and stepped outside. As I was looking around, I noticed a child wandering off towards the fields. I called out, "Hey kid, where are you going?" But he didn't respond. He just kept walking further into the darkness. I couldn't see anyone who seemed to be with the child, so I followed him. As I got closer, I realized the bus was far behind, and I had entered a part of the field surrounded by tall grass and bushes. Suddenly, I saw the child standing next to a woman dressed in ragged clothes, her face covered by a shawl. An eerie feeling washed over me as I noticed something peculiar about her. Her feet were facing the wrong direction. Panic-stricken, I turned and ran back towards the bus. Despite my sprint, it felt like the woman was right beside me, whispering in a strange, unfamiliar language. All I could make out was her saying something like, "Why are you running? Stop and look at me." I kept running, chanting prayers under my breath, not daring to look back. Eventually, I reached the bus, drenched in sweat. The passengers and my co-driver were puzzled. I urged them to drive on quickly, unable to explain what I had just experienced. As we continued our journey, I couldn't shake off her words. "I'll be watching you every time you pass by." The whole night's ordeal left me shaken. As dawn broke, our bus merged back onto the main route. I felt a bit of relief, knowing we were back on familiar roads, and the sunlight helped ease my nerves. We eventually made a stop in a small town to rest and check in with some locals. I, along with my co-driver, decided to ask if they knew anything about the strange road we took and the woman I encountered. One of the locals explained that the route was rarely used because it was prone to landslides. He told us a story that sent chills down my spine. Several years ago, during a particularly bad landslide, a bus had tried to take that same shortcut. The bus veered off the road and tumbled down a steep ravine. Many people were killed, including a mother and her child. Ever since that tragic accident, people have reported hearing screams and seeing strange apparitions near the site. The locals mentioned that it was believed the spirits of the mother and child haunted the area, still screaming for help. When I told the locals about my encounter, they said I was lucky to have not looked directly at the woman, as those who did were said to be cursed or driven mad. They reassured me that many people had similar experiences on that road and that it was not just me. It felt somewhat comforting to know I wasn't alone, but the chilling memory of that night, the whispering woman, and the thought of being watched lingered in my mind. From that day on, every time I drove the bus through the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, making each journey a little more haunting than the last. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman might be following me. Every creak in the bus, every shadow, made me jump. But we eventually reached our destination, and I finally felt a semblance of safety as the sun rose and we pulled into the familiar bus depot. The locals there were friendly and curious about why we looked so haggard. After some rest, I shared my story with a few of them. They told me that the area we had passed was notorious for strange happenings, and that many had heard the cries and seen apparitions of the unfortunate souls who had died there, especially the mother and her child. What unsettled me the most were the woman's final words. "You escaped this time, but next time, you won't be so lucky." Even now, whenever I recall that night, I can still hear her calm voice amid my panic sprint. I decided to keep this experience close to my chest, sharing it only with those who I thought would understand. It remains one of the most haunting experiences of my career. Every trip through those mountains, I can't help but feel a shiver down my spine, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if she's still watching. I stayed at my uncle's place in the Appalachian Mountains while attending college in a nearby town. The college was about an hour's drive from my uncle's house, but staying with him saved me a lot of travel time. One day, after college, I boarded the 4:30 p.m. bus, which was always packed. Finding a seat was rare, so I usually stood for the entire journey. However, that day, I noticed an empty seat near an old woman dressed in black. Despite the crowd, no one was sitting next to her or around her, which I found odd, but didn't think much about it. The next day, I boarded the same bus, and the same scenario repeated. The woman was there, but no one sat near her. I took the seat next to her again. This continued for about 4 or 5 days. The woman seemed normal, dressed in a black outfit with a shawl covering her face, her arms adorned with several bangles. On Sunday, I went home for the weekend. When I returned to college on Monday, everything was back to routine. At 4:30 p.m., I boarded the bus again, but this time the woman wasn't there. Having gotten used to her presence, it felt odd. I sat in the same spot, and once again, no one sat near me. As I settled in, a pregnant woman boarded the bus. I noticed that all the seats were occupied except for the 3 around me. I offered her my seat, but she declined, insisting that she didn't want to sit there. Puzzled, I asked her why. She replied, "It's not you. It's the woman who usually sits here." Confused, I pointed out that the woman wasn't there today. She explained, "It doesn't matter if she's here or not. She could be anywhere." Her words were strange and unsettling. Eventually, an elderly man explained that the woman who sat next to me was considered a witch in the area. Everyone knew about her, except me. I had only been in the area for about 2 weeks and didn't know the local stories. The elderly man told me that the woman was notorious for her evil deeds, and no one wanted to be associated with her. The villagers had good reasons to avoid the witch. There were 3 particularly chilling stories about her. The first story took place a few years ago. The witch lived in a house above another family's home. This family consisted of a husband, his wife, their elderly mother, and 2 young children. They were a happy family, living peacefully with their 2 fields just a short distance from their home. One night, after her husband returned home, the wife told him about the strange happenings in their fields. They often found eerie statues with demonic faces, sometimes smeared with what looked like blood. Enraged, they both stormed up to the witch's house, shouting and threatening her to stop her antics or face dire consequences. The witch, unfazed, shouted back, warning them that they would regret crossing her. A few days later, on a Sunday, the family decided to visit the wife's parents. They packed into their car and set off, but never reached their destination. On the way, their car veered off the road and plunged into a ravine. Witnesses said the car suddenly swerved for no apparent reason, as if the driver had lost control. The entire family perished in the accident. The villagers believed that the witch had caused the accident, appearing in front of the car and causing the driver to lose control. They were convinced that her curse had come true, as she had vowed to destroy the entire family. Within a week of the confrontation, the family was gone, just as the witch had threatened. Another tale involved a villager who decided to take a shortcut through the woods instead of the long bus ride. It was quite late, around 9 or 10 p.m., as he began his trek. About halfway, he reached a narrow stream where all the runoff water flowed down, carrying debris with it. As the villager walked alongside the stream, he noticed a figure standing by the water. Despite being a brave and seasoned villager, he couldn't help but feel a shiver of fear. He stopped to observe the figure more closely. To his horror, he realized it was the witch. She appeared unnaturally tall, her long, thick hair trailing on the ground, and her arms outstretched towards the sky. Her tongue was unnaturally long, extending far out of her mouth. Panic set in as the villagers saw her eerie form, her hair billowing in the wind and her eyes fixed on the sky. He turned and ran up the hillside, reciting prayers to ward off the evil. Fortunately, The witch seemed to be in the middle of some ritual and did not pursue him. Maybe she couldn't abandon what she was doing. The villager eventually reached home, trembling and in shock. His wife was alarmed by his condition, as he seemed to be in a state of shock and fever. Neighbors gathered, concerned about what had happened. When the villager finally told them what he had seen, it became another story that spread through the village, cementing the witch's fearsome reputation. The third story took place during a wedding in the village. The entire village had gathered for the festivities. As the groom sat down for the turmeric ceremony, the witch suddenly appeared. She was dressed in her usual black attire, carrying a staff, her white hair flowing down her back. As she approached to apply the turmeric to the groom, his mother quickly intervened, declaring the ceremony over and rushing everyone inside. The witch, furious at being thwarted, stood in the yard, banging her staff on the ground and cursing the family. The whole village was terrified. They knew that if the witch had touched the groom, it would have meant a curse. Over time, the groom's mental state deteriorated. He became mentally unstable, often running away from home and being found near the stream where the witch was often seen. Doctors provided various diagnoses, from trauma to depression, but the villagers were convinced that it was the witch's doing. His condition worsened, and he became physically weak, barely able to survive. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before he succumbed to the curse. When I learned these stories, I was terrified. I told my uncle and aunt, who immediately took me to a local priest for protection rituals. From that day on, I never took the 4:30 p.m. bus again, opting instead to travel with my uncle at 7:30 p.m. The fear of encountering the witch was too great. I recently moved to a bustling city for my job, leaving behind my small town in the Appalachian Mountains. It was my first time in such a big city, with its towering buildings, busy nightlife, and constant activity. However, I longed for my village's simplicity, fields, and lifestyle. The job, though, was a responsibility I couldn't ignore. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment and settled into a routine: go to the office, come back to my flat, and get meals from a nearby shop. Time passed, and soon it was time for a break. During the holidays, I went back to my village for about 12 days, enjoying every moment with my family and the simple life I loved. After the break, it was time to return to the city. I booked a bus ticket for the journey back. As I boarded the bus, my family came to see me off, and I felt quite emotional leaving them. The bus had very few passengers, just a few people, which was unusual. As the bus began its journey, I noticed a woman sitting a few seats ahead of me and a man lying down at the back. The ride was long and tiring, around 10 hours. After about 4 hours, the bus made a stop near a town. A new passenger, a woman dressed in a long black dress with a black shawl covering her face, boarded the bus. I was half asleep with my headphones on, but the woman's appearance caught my attention. Her attire was unusual, and she moved slowly, almost as if she were very old. She made her way down the aisle, holding onto the seats for support, and sat directly across from me. As the bus continued, I noticed the woman staring at me. It was unsettling. She didn't look at anything else, just me. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling was too strong. It felt like her eyes were piercing through me, and it gave me an eerie sensation. Suddenly, the woman stood up and pulled my headphone out. Startled, I asked if she needed help. She asked me about a specific stop, a small town further along the route. I told her we still had some time before we reached it, but the way she stared at me was unnerving. The woman's continuous staring made me increasingly uncomfortable. She then asked me again about the stop, her voice sounding almost ghostly. I reassured her that it would be a while before we arrived, trying to remain calm. After a few more hours, we reached the stop she mentioned. She slowly got up and left the bus, disappearing into the night. I felt a strange relief as she left, but the encounter stayed with me. The bus continued its journey, and I finally reached my stop and headed back to my apartment. The eerie feeling from the bus ride lingered, making it hard for me to shake off the unease. A few days later, I realized the woman might have been staring at me because she wanted to ask about the stop but felt awkward. This thought gave me some relief. One evening, as I settled into my apartment, I noticed the candy the woman had given me. Remembering her kind gesture, I ate the candy. Not long after, I started feeling very strange. My stomach churned, and my head began to spin. At first, I thought it was motion sickness from the long bus ride, but the pain grew unbearable. It felt like sharp rocks pounding inside my head, and every bone in my body ached, as if being twisted. I somehow managed to make it to my stop and took a cab back to my apartment. The pain continued, unrelenting, and I had only a few hours before I had to be at or 7 friends arrived. They were hesitant to enter, but they knew they had to help me. As they approached, they saw me sitting with my shoulders shaking violently. One of them found the light switch and turned it on. They were horrified to see me holding a knife, repeatedly stabbing a strange doll with hair tied around its legs. They rushed to restrain me, but I looked at them with eyes that were unnaturally red and a twisted expression on my face. My lips were contorted, revealing my teeth in a grotesque manner. Despite my thin frame, it took 4 of them to hold me down as I screamed, "Let me go, or I'll kill you all." My friends were terrified, but managed to wrestle the knife away from me. They called for an ambulance, and I was taken to the hospital. The doctors were baffled by my condition, unable to explain the sudden and severe symptoms. At the hospital, I was sedated and kept under observation. My friends stayed by my side, worried and confused. The doctors ran several tests, but couldn't find any physical cause for my condition. They suggested it might be psychological, triggered by extreme stress or trauma. As I slowly regained consciousness, the pain subsided, but the memory of the woman on the bus and the strange events haunted me. My friends told me about my behavior, and I was horrified. I couldn't remember any of it. The doctors recommended therapy, and I began seeing a psychologist. Through therapy, I started to piece together the events and realized that the candy the woman gave me might have been cursed. The psychologist suggested it could be a manifestation of my subconscious fears, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something supernatural was at play. One night, while trying to sleep, I felt the presence of the woman again. It was as if she was whispering in my ear. I called my friend, begging for help, and he rushed over. By the time he arrived, I was in a daze, losing control over my body. When my friend found me, I was trembling and muttering incoherently. He called for an ambulance, and I was taken to the hospital again. This time, a doctor who believed in supernatural phenomena suggested we visit a local priest. Desperate for answers, my friends and I took the doctor's advice. The priest tied a protective thread around my wrist, and I immediately felt nauseous. I began to vomit, and to everyone's horror, long nails came out of my mouth. The priest explained that the woman was a witch, using dark magic to try and take over my body. The protective measures saved me, but the experience left me traumatized.